Hello and welcome to the Majlis, the podcast by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, focusing on Central Asia. I am Mohammed Tahir, your host here in Washington, D.C. Recently, Uzbekistan is more often in the news, and sometimes it's for good reason. That is because since the death of former President Islam Karimov and Shaukat Mirziyoyev assuming power almost a year ago, certain things began changing. Some political prisoners were released. Uzbekistan has slightly shifted its isolationist approach in terms of its relations with immediate neighbors. And as we speak, President Mirziyoyev is in Turkey, I guess, first such visit after 20 years. Even more importantly, we see visits from international organizations such as Human Rights Watch and representatives of the UN's human rights body taking place to Uzbekistan. While some positive changes are indeed happening, there are certain areas the authorities aren't touching, such as freedom of press, torture in prison, travel restrictions, political liberalizations, and so forth. On today's Majlis, we plan to examine these changes and dynamics behind them, and also touch open areas where changes aren't visible as the other areas to understand what is blocking the progress. First, let me welcome my guests. Steve Severlo, Human Rights Watch's Central Asia researcher, is joining us from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's studios in Prague today. Next to him is Bruce Pannier, editor of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Central Asia blog called Kishlok Owazi. Also joining us from Prague is Rajitin Tolivov, broadcaster at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Uzbek service. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Great to be here in the Prague studio.
So let's start with you, Steve. You just put out a detailed report on Uzbekistan. Looking into this document, one can't help but to sense your excitement. I don't know if it's a strong word, or maybe to put it in this way, your optimism for change. So walk us through some of your findings and your thoughts on recent developments.
Well, you're right. There's optimism that characterizes the report, but we actually titled it Cautious Optimism for Change. And what we tried to do was really look at a wide spectrum of human rights issues. What's changed? What's not changed? Where's there been progress? Where's not been progress? Now, there has been a lot of information or a lot of attention given to the release of what, by our count now, 16 political prisoners in the last 13 months since Mirziyoyev assumed the presidency. And we tried to analyze that issue, looking at those releases, but of course then the arrests of one writer, one journalist at the same time, just in the last month, which is very troubling, Baba Murad Abdullayev and Nurullah Mohammad Rauf Khan. But in addition to the political prisoner issue, we also tried to track developments in the realm of judicial reform. So, for example, we have seen that there have been some moves in the judiciary to afford more power or more independence to judges, or at least in theory, they could have more independence, or they could have a path towards life tenure, which could make them more independent from the executive branch in rendering their decisions. We also saw a very underreported, yet from an international law perspective, significant change whereby people arrested have to be brought before a judge now within 48 hours rather than 72 hours. That's important when you consider how big of a problem torture is, and that it usually happens in the first hours or first days after someone is arrested. So we looked at judicial reform. We looked, as you mentioned in your introduction, to freedom of expression. And I absolutely agree that there hasn't been a real liberalization of that space. But of course, we have welcomed the appearance of some live talk shows, which appeared for only a time in Uzbekistan, and a somewhat larger appetite among the state press to take on critical issues. We've seen the publication Kun.uz and even Podrobna.uz dealing with issues they wouldn't have dealt with a year ago. So we welcome that, but of course we also see that no political parties have been registered, and there certainly hasn't really been a dramatic increase in the amount of peaceful public protests. So one of the recommendations we make in the report in that section, and we look at, is that the government should be taking steps to send the message to civil society that they now have a role in this transition, this very important transitional period. So, for example, you should have the registration of groups that work on politically sensitive issues like torture, freedom of religion. Those sorts of things haven't happened in a really long time. There hasn't been an NGO registered that works on those sorts of issues in Uzbekistan since 2002. Moving on from civil society, we look at, of course, the changes in the cotton sector. There has been a lot of pressure on the government to make changes in that realm, and that's probably the reason we've seen, fairly decisive moves made to ban picking of cotton by public sector workers, by teachers and students, and there has been a strong push of, we estimate, maybe around 200,000 people that have been returned from the fields back to their places of work. And yet, of course, we continue to see still instances of forced labor and intimidation of activists. We looked at religious freedom. We saw that it's significant that 16,000 persons have been relieved of the obligation, let's say, to report to the police about their whereabouts and their activities for so-called extremist activity. They can now go about their lives, maybe obtain employment more easily, travel more easily. That's important if, of course, that practice continues and those people really are allowed to live their lives freely. So we go through all those changes, and we can say that these are positive signs and that they have to be followed up on, they have to be deepened, and they have to be transformed into structural reforms.
Let's take Sirajuddin, your take on this. So do you share some of the points that Steve has just raised, especially in terms of these, some which Steve called positive changes in Uzbekistan?
Yeah, of course, definitely. But I think the government in Uzbekistan still leading the country with authoritarian methods. From the strong authoritarian country, Uzbekistan turning into mild authoritarian country. The Shavkat Mirziyoyev himself is a fruit of that old regime. The government hasn't changed it too much. The approach to human rights issues, religious freedom, freedom of speech, or socio-economic problems haven't been changed dramatically. And I think we can feel that there are not enough specialists, and Uzbekistan genuinely wants to develop. Mirziyoyev is striving for that, but there are some groups, secret organizations, I don't know, who are trying to put obstacles into his way. This is my assumption so far.
Sirajuddin, what makes you believe that that is the case, that there is some secret group who is trying to block?
I think, within the government structures, there are those who do not like the ways of Shavkat Mirziyoyev carrying out reforms, structural changes, dismissal of high officials.
Who are they, Sirajuddin? Who are they?
There are certainly within the upper echelons of the government those who lost their power, those who don't want to make strong changes, those who are afraid of consequences. There are within the government itself. But I think Mirziyoyev is not powerful enough to openly struggle against them at the moment.
Okay. So, Bruce, when you look at these recent developments, the ones that Steve mentioned and also the ones raised by Sirajuddin, what do you see happening?
Well, of course, there was a lot of baggage there that he had to clear away, that's for sure. 25 years of a rule by Islam Karimov have left Uzbekistan in pretty bad shape. I'd have to say that I'm still surprised that he's been able to accomplish as much as he has. In a year, that's for sure. Again, and we've mentioned this before, a lot of the things that he's doing, if you look at it from the perspective of Uzbekistan trying to get its economy back on its feet, which has got to be certainly one of the, if not the priority for Mirziyoyev, then a lot of stuff that he's doing, you could explain through that lens, that he needs investment from everybody that he can possibly get from any outside source. So there's some concessions that have to be made to make Uzbekistan look more attractive to investors, say, from the West. Now by coming at the cotton campaign, for instance, and to give him some credit, it seems to have been, the number of forced laborers seems to have been reduced somewhat. We don't know how much. I couldn't say how much this year, but it doesn't seem like they actually conscripted 1 million or 1.2 million people to come out. It seems like it was probably less than that. They did say that they were going to pay them more than they had in the past, and that's not saying much because in some cases they weren't paid anything. But he's making Uzbekistan look attractive to the outside world as much as he can. So some of these statements when he criticizes the prosecutor's office, well, yeah, that plays good at home because it makes people think that, he's going to do something about, the corruption in the prosecutor's office. And of course, a lot of people have had their own encounters with that particular agency, but in the end, it doesn't really, we haven't seen that he's like drastically overhauled the prosecutor general's office too much. He just criticized them and encouraged people to rat them out as much as possible too. So, it's kind of hard to say how far this is going to go. It's my fear that once Uzbekistan's economy gets back on its feet, that a lot of the Mr. Nice Guy that we see now is going to disappear.
Yeah, you touched upon economy, investment, Bruce. Last week, Senator Alisher Kurmanov was here in Washington, D.C., who's the chairman of Uzbekistan's Senate's Foreign Relations Committee. So he gave a very positive speech at the Senate building. If someone has no idea about the background of Uzbekistan, would think, wow, this is the best place to go and invest. But when we asked about the possibility of representatives of international organizations, especially the media, when they might be able to come back and resume their operations, they said, we still yet to work on that. So talking about media, Sirajuddin, authorities obviously yet to touch anything related to press and many things about human rights, obviously. Have you seen any improvement in your day-to-day work and the work of your journalists and your ability to report from and about Uzbekistan?
You see, there are changes, of course, since Mirziyoyev came to power. The new media organizations, especially in the digital sector, appeared, and they are openly criticizing the smaller issues, socio-economic issues, like corruption among the prosecutors, for example, or how brutal is the head of the collective farm is. But they did not go further from that. I think, yes, there are positive steps. Yes, they're willing to openly discuss shortages in economy, in social sphere, in medicine, or in a sport, but not further than that. There are still limits. And, for example, they cannot openly discuss how brutal is police interior ministry is, or how SMB, that secret services in Uzbekistan, have been harshly been repressing religious groups. I think they sense still threat from upper echelons of the government.
So just on media, can I step in and say that we have at least 4, by my count, journalists in prison. We have heard some rumors that imprisoned journalist Dilmurod Saidov might be one of the next people on the list, hopefully to be released. But we also have in prison Yusuf Ruzi Muradov, who shared his case with Muhammad Bikjanov in prison for 18 years. And there's no reason he shouldn't be released right now. We have Gairat Mekhliboyev, who PEN International recognizes as an imprisoned journalist. And then, of course, you have the new arrest of Bobo Murad Abdullayev, the very murky case where the government says that he was writing texts in connection with the opposition. So, those are, of course, things that Mirziyoyev could move on very quickly if he wanted to.
Yeah.
This is why I think that Mirziyoyev could do it and is willing to do so, but there are certain forces that Mirziyoyev is not ready to fight against.
Interesting. Sirajuddin, one thing I have noticed recently is, I don't know whether it's a positive news or something behind that maybe. So as soon as a prisoner gets released, they speak to your service, Ozotlik. I have listened to some of those interviews. It appears that they speak their mind. There are some praise in it, some criticism of the regime. So why it is happening? It wasn't the case in the past.
It was, in fact, the case in the past, but we couldn't hear their voice. Yes, but most of those who were released since Mirziyoyev came to power spent many years behind the bars, and they have nothing to lose. For example, Azamjan Turgunov spent 11 years, or Muhammad Bigjan, the longest-serving journalist probably in the world, and he is also open because they had enough time to think, to come to conclusion over the years. and they think that they have nothing to lose, and they feel, I would say, responsible for those who are still in the prisons of Uzbekistan.
We did an interview when I was on the ground in Tashkent with Erkin Musayev, who was released about 2 months ago. His case is a little bit different. He wasn't an activist. He was actually a government official who was caught up in a wave of the post-Andijan anti-Western hysteria. He was accused of spying. But what was really interesting in his case, and he's fresh out of jail, and he was talking with incredible pragmatism and optimism about things that could be done immediately to improve conditions in prisons. He had this idea that there should be these glass see-through, baskets or deposit areas where prisoners can see the letters that they send to government institutions complaining about, whether it's torture or mistreatment, because often their letters just disappear. And so he was saying, why couldn't Mirziyoyev set up this system of, transparent baskets of complaints, and that would give people confidence that their letters are getting to the right place. And I mean, this was remarkably practical from someone who's just gotten out of prison. And, I would say that optimism, in a way, that's the way I guess you get through prison, is by being an optimist. So that was the case with everyone I met. Murad Jurayev, who spent 21 years in prison, Muhammad Bigjanov, and Erkin Musayev was an optimism and at least a great hope of the potential that this transitional period represents.
Bruce, what's your take on this? Like the fact that they are speaking up immediately after their release. Steve was able to meet some of them personally, and I have heard lots of interviews coming out from our Azatlik of those recently released prisoners. What do you think about this change? Is it because that they are really feel responsible to share their thoughts, or it has to do something with the recent changes in the government?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both, actually. One, yes, certainly they want to speak out because, as we've heard, a lot of people that friends, and acquaintances, people that they got to know in jail are still in jail. So, they want to speak up for them and remind people that there are still people being held unjustly in these prisons, and they should be let go. Now, we know that, Mirziyoyev is going very slowly about changing the image of Uzbekistan. It's not Karimov's country anymore. And when all these people that are being let out, were of course jailed by Karimov. So them complaining about the situation, their incarceration, the charges that were against them, and even Muhammad Bekjan said that his enemy is dead. Now that serves Mirziyoyev's purpose too. He's trying to distinguish his government from Karimov's government. So the people that get out criticize Karimov's government, and they're thankful to Mirziyoyev for being out. So there's already, he's separating himself from the previous leader. Like I said, I'm sure all the people that get out are speaking sincerely about, what happened there and their desire that more people will follow them out of the prisons very soon. But it also serves Mirziyoyev's purpose to remind the people that the Karimov's the one that put him in, and implicitly Mirziyoyev is the one that let them out.
Okay, let me take a break here. Hey everyone, before we get into the second part of the show, just a quick reminder that if you really like the Majlis podcast, there's a real chance that you will also like my other radio show that's called Gandhara Podcast. The show discusses latest developments in Pakistan and Afghanistan from local perspective. And the podcast is published in every second week on Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Gandhara website. It's a totally must-follow discussion for foreign policy nerds with interest in the region. Welcome back, gentlemen, to the Majlis. Today we are discussing recent developments in Uzbekistan, diving deep into recent developments to understand the meaning of all these changes, why some things are moving and why some things are not moving forward. To discuss all these, I am joined by Steve Severlo, Central Asia researcher at the Human Rights Watch, Bruce Pannier, editor of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Central Asia blog, Kishlok Owazi, Sirajuddin Tolipov, broadcaster at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Uzbek service. I am Mohammed Tahir, host of the Majlis here in Washington, D.C. So, Steve, actually, you are the star of this podcast today, in part that you are one of the few people who made to Uzbekistan after the recent political changes, met with officials and spoke to some of the victims, as you were mentioning earlier. Tell us please, how was it to be back to Uzbekistan?
Well, when I was getting off the plane and an official came up to me and said, "Walk this way," I thought maybe it was going to be bad news. But pretty quickly, I was surprised to see that our delegation was sort of treated, with a sort of VIP treatment. And that's not the kind of reception Human Rights Watch is at all used to in Central Asia. I can't remember a time when Human Rights Watch was received at the highest levels of government in Central Asia or even in a lot of the former Soviet space. And so, one could be very cynical and say this was all a PR exercise and that Human Rights Watch was instrumentalized from start to finish. And certainly a lot of it was orchestrated. But I should say that with, what pertains to our meetings with the government, at least I can say that these conversations were incredibly substantive. They were critical exchanges. And it was pretty clear to us that there certainly wasn't any suggestion that Human Rights Watch should be changing the way it works. There were a lot of disagreements, and there was some awkwardness in a lot of the issues that we were raising. We were raising political prisoners. We were raising torture. We were raising the way religion manifests itself and is practiced in Uzbekistan. These are issues that go to the core assumptions and really the DNA of the whole system. Yeah. So I didn't expect that they would be easy. But I was surprised that officials were pretty forthcoming about saying that they felt that this is a new political era in which a lot more things are possible. So in that regard, I was pleasantly surprised, and it sort of gave me more resolve to that Human Rights Watch should be doing as much as we can, not just to closely monitor developments, but to make as specific recommendations as possible. So in this report today that we came out with, which in many ways is a result of the trip that we took, we have a long list of recommendations. I mean, we met with NGOs that told us that it's very difficult for them to do anything on the ground with the sort of legislation you have in place. You have a 2015 law, for example, where if you want to do anything in Uzbekistan as a non-governmental organization, you want to hold a press conference, you want to meet with someone, you need to get advanced prior approval from the Ministry of Justice 20 days before that happens, even just a simple meeting. And so, we try to be really practical with the government and say, if you're serious about reform, you actually need to create a space in which civil society can exist, in which reporters can freely ask questions. In other regards, just on a personal level, I felt that times had changed a bit. There was more economic activity on the streets. There were more people walking around, for example, the Broadway. They call it the Broadway. It's the main alleyway where a lot of people hang out at night in Tashkent. There seemed to be a vibrancy that I hadn't felt when I was there in 2010, which is a good thing. Youth seemed to be more active. And certainly the questions we got at the press conference where Human Rights Watch appeared were in some cases sensitive. And we were able to talk about the Andijan massacre and torture. So, that was all hopeful. On the same token, though, people came to us on the margins of our official meetings and told us about forced labor and told us about the fear that still reigns and the power of the security services and the absolute arbitrariness with which life often takes place in Uzbekistan. So it was a mixture of impressions and, but it left me with a sense of hope.
Okay. Now you are planning to go back, Steve. Obviously, your intention is to return there permanently. Are you at liberty to discuss at what stage are you in making this happen?
I can say that we're trying to create the conditions for us to do our work on a constant basis. So we're having discussions with the government and the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the National Human Rights Center about, work permits, accreditation, and all those things. It's going to be a long process, but so far, there are no major setbacks, I can say.
Okay, Sirajuddin, Bruce, feel free if you have any question to ask Steve at this moment. And also, I was just referring earlier, Steve, that there were a delegation from Uzbekistan. Their objective seemed to be that they want to attract investment there from U.S. business circle. So in that meeting, later I had the chance to talk to some of them. It seemed that you become a household name for some Uzbek officials who speak about this engagement, that the ones you were mentioning, as if important things are being achieved. What are your achievements so far from this engagement?
What does Human Rights Watch get out of it? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's important for us to, obviously we can continue doing our work in the way we've done it in the past. We verify information from outside the country and we can continue to do that. But I think it's important for any researcher or any journalist to look someone in the eye and try to understand their life experience at close range. I think it's also really useful to meet with the government directly and have really open exchanges. And I don't mean to, I'm not trying to be overly diplomatic about it. I have in mind a few exchanges we had there in Tashkent where we were able to, maybe for the first time ever, or at least the first time in a long time, explain directly to government officials why we use the term political prisoner. What is it connected to? We explained that it's not about bashing them over the head, that in fact the term political prisoner relates to the fact that a lot of criminal cases in Uzbekistan, or the way crimes are actually defined, aren't consistent with international legal obligations of the government. And that's why we use this word or this term political prisoner. And I don't know if there was an aha moment on the government side, but at least I felt that they were going to communicate our criticisms to the president, to the president's office, to the security services. And, to some extent, I hope that gets results. Obviously, the benefit of being there is that we can react in real time to the arrest of people, that we can raise the stakes and we can get the word out about abuses on a local level. That's, of course, what any human rights observer wants to do, is have all the information and react as quickly as possible.
But Steve, how you are making sure that they aren't using this engagement just as a PR without really offering you anything significant in exchange? I mean, what is the stage when you will say move on or move back from this engagement?
It's step by step. I mean, I think if we try to call it as we see it, and certainly we continue to characterize the human rights situation as atrocious. I mean, you still have thousands of political prisoners, and you still have widespread torture. I think, the European Court of Human Rights has more than 10 decisions that says that it's unlawful for most European countries to send anyone back to Uzbekistan with the risk of torture that exists. And so I think, we're by no means changing our tune. And certainly we are aware of the problems of being used for some sort of PR exercise. But again, I think the real test, I think, would be that I would ask myself is, am I putting someone in danger in Uzbekistan, someone that I meet with? I think that's the most important thing for any human rights organization, is do no harm. Certainly we may be played with on a certain level by government officials for certain ends, but the most important thing, I think, is that we do no harm to actual people on the ground. And we're just going to try to be professional in the way we work. But still, we're going to take the government at their word. If they are releasing significant numbers of people, we're going to welcome that, and we're going to call on them to do more. The problem for them is that probably our asks, Human Rights Watch's recommendations, are not going to end. There's not going to be a point where we say, oh, everything's great now in Uzbekistan. It's, welcome back to the community of civilized nations. I think it's a process. And, we try to explain that we put out probably more critical reports in the United States than we ever do on Uzbekistan. And, if we can normalize that whole issue of criticism, and if the government can start to invite people like Yelena Orlaeva and some of the other activists into conversations, and perhaps on TV, on these live talk show hosts, if they appear again, if you have some more sensitive discussions happening out in public, then that desensitizes the public space to something that's not existed for a long time.
Okay, let's talk in the same sense about general development dynamics, Bruce. Now, everyone seems to be in the cautious, optimistic mood when describing the situation in Uzbekistan. So what is the stage one has to make his or her mind about whether to remain cautiously optimistic or change the tune?
Wow, I've been asking myself that for months now. I mean, at what point do you believe?
Yeah.
I think when we, right now it's kind of mixed, like we've heard. They let some people out of prison, but then they put some in. They make good statements about, like supposedly they're not going to have to use forced labor or really hardly anybody in the fields, cotton fields, by 2021 or 2023 or something, because they're going to have mechanized farming. It'll be to that point where they won't have to do it. So there's a lot of fair words, and there's some fair deeds being gone too. But there's still the bad stuff still happens. So while you can say it's better than it was, and keep some optimism, because let's face it, by the last couple of years of Karimov, it was pretty much just bad news. There wasn't, somebody get thrown in prison, but nobody get let out. People get marched into the fields, but there's no promises that they're ever going to get that's not going to be the case in the future. So we got to get to the point where we're on a real positive. There will be some regression, but it has to be overwhelmingly positive at that point. Certainly, if they would legalize independent political parties, I would consider that to be a huge step in the right direction. If people were able to hold peaceful public gatherings, even if they were criticizing some government policy, I would consider that to be a huge step forward. So you get a combination of those kind of things, and then it would make a believer out of me.
Okay. Sirajuddin, your take on the same point?
I think last week the deputy head of Tashkent police, the capital Tashkent police, warned citizens of Uzbekistan that without permission of local authorities, they don't have any right to have illegal gatherings, meetings, marches, anything. It reminded me at times of when Karimov issued a special decree banning all gatherings, public gatherings. And I came to conclusion in that point that Uzbek government is concerned that it may lose the control over people. And now the case is to be or not to be. I think honeymoons for Shavkat Mirziyoyev is over. Now that we will see genuine face or desire of Mirziyoyev for reforms. If he is ready, if he is genuine, then we'll see serious changes. For example, opening up, allowing or re-registering the opposition parties, allowing those opposition activists who live in exile to return to the country, to allow criticism of the government openly, to allow to set up independent newspapers, radio stations, TV stations. We haven't seen any of these so far. So I am cautiously optimistic, but it may end quite soon.
Okay.
I just want to say that's a good point by Sirajuddin, that some of the good things that have happened in a more authoritarian way, and that the overall trajectory over time of Uzbekistan has been authoritarian. And so even the appearance of, for example, these presidential reception centers, which are so popular throughout the country, which appear to be resolving a lot of everyday problems of citizens, even that has been done in some ways a very managed, very authoritarian style, because that network of reception centers are controlled directly by the president himself, by the presidential apparatus, and it's sort of adding one more layer of bureaucracy on top of others. And so even in the sort of positive changes, they've been characterized by this authoritarian hand. And I think what we want to see again is the emergence of civil society in the broadest sense, of a legal profession, of a business community, of human rights activists, of religious organizations. We haven't really mentioned much of the fact that, Protestant groups are under enormous pressure, constantly getting arrested. And you had recently, just in the last few weeks, the visit by the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion. And presumably he raised those issues when he saw Mirziyoyev, and it remains to be seen. Will Christian communities be able to function and exercise their faith peacefully without problems going forward? Will the LGBT community in Uzbekistan have more protection? There are a number of things that we haven't even touched on, and I think we have to remain vigilant.
Okay, thank you very much. With this optimistic point from Steve Severlo, Central Asia researcher at the Human Rights Watch, and also big thanks to Bruce Pannier, editor of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Central Asia blog, Kishlog Owazi, and Sirajuddin Talipov, broadcaster at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Uzbek service. Thank you for your time and thoughts, gentlemen, today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this is from me, Mohammed Tahir, host of the Majlis, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Central Asia podcast. Until next week, bye-bye.